Sick, dude. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. World War II. And she's gone. In the duration of just about 4 years of war, some of the most heinous atrocities happened. There are many, many stories of strong resistance against the Nazis, like people that hid Jewish families, helped Jewish families escape Nazi persecution, spies, revolters, soldiers, all of the above. And many have medals and honors for their heroic work. So I asked myself, who is the most decorated war hero for the Allies? If you're like me, and you thought that, and you Googled it, Audie Murphy comes up. By the end of the war, he had a total of 28 medals. Now, we're not knocking him at all here. That's amazing, and he has an amazing story. But he wasn't the #1 person wanted by the German Gestapo and the most decorated heroine during World War II. That goes to Nancy Wake. Let's get started. I felt that wearing the Divergent Dauntless Factor shirt fits this whole vibe we got going on here. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born on August 30th, 1912 in Roseneath, Wellington, New Zealand. She was the youngest of 6 kids to her father, Charles Augustus Wake, who was a journalist, and her mother, Ella Wake. Are we serious? Nancy was Maori through her great-grandmother, Pauria. I know I mispronounced that, my mouth can't form it. Maori are indigenous Polynesian people of the mainland of New Zealand. Nancy's great-grandmother was supposedly one of the first Maori women to marry a European. When Nancy was about 2 years old, her family moved to North Sydney, Australia. Shortly after the move, however, her father went back to New Zealand under the lie that he was going to film a documentary about the Maori tribe and leaving her mother in Australia to raise and provide for the kids. Dad sucks. While in Sydney, Nancy's childhood was full of poverty and was very unstable. She went to the North Sydney Household Arts School, and at the age of 16, she ran away from home and found work as a nurse. Around the age of 20, Nancy received an inheritance from an aunt totaling about 200 pounds. That's 16,075 pounds today, and in US dollars, that's $20,468.52. With this surprise money, Nancy booked a ticket to New York City, then from there traveled to London, where she essentially faked her way into journalism. She told a Hearst newspaper executive that she was fluent in Egyptian. She told him that she knew Egyptian because she somehow found out that that was his favorite topic. Then she wrote some gibberish in shorthand that resembled hieroglyphics, and somehow she convinced him that that was the language. I don't know how that works, but whatever. I mean, how do you do gibberish and hieroglyphics? Like, in my mind, hieroglyphics is a pretty hard thing to fake. But I mean, shoot, maybe he's not that proficient in Egyptian hieroglyphics. With her work as a journalist, Nancy began to live a very good lifestyle. And by the 1930s, her newspaper sent her to Paris as a European correspondent. Not a bad gig in my mind. And if you're following the timeline here, this was around the time that Adolf Hitler started to gain power. In 1936, Nancy met a rich industrialist and heir to the Marseille shipping business, Henry Edmond Fiocca. And on November 30th, 1939, they married and 3 years later settled in the French town of Marseille. With this marriage, Nancy became very comfortable with the rich Parisian social life. She told the Daily Telegraph about her husband, saying, quote, "He was tall, he could dance the tango, and if you dance the tango with a nice, tall man, you know what eventually will happen, don't you?" End quote. I mean, duh. While living in Marseille, the Nazis invaded France in May of 1940, and Nancy became an ambulance driver. Her desire to fight the Nazis began with a visit to Vienna in the mid-1930s as a journalist. She saw Nazi gangs randomly beating Jewish men and women in the open streets. That event made her make a promise to herself, quote, "If ever the opportunity arose, I would do everything I could to stop the Nazi movement. My hatred of the Nazis was very, very deep," end quote. When France fell to the Nazis in June of 1940, Nancy and her husband's wealth and social standing gave them relative safety and a bit of a cover. Due to that, Nancy began to insert herself into local resistant groups. With her work as an ambulance driver, she was able to gradually deepen her involvement in an escape line from her home in Marseille. With her ambulance, she became a courier and a transporter, helping escaping Jewish and Allied soldiers escape France into the safety of Spain. Since Nancy was the wife of a wealthy, prominent businessman, she was able to travel across the borders with ease. Quote, "It was much easier for us, to travel all over France. A woman could get out of a lot of trouble that a man could not," end quote. She would drive up to a German checkpoint using her charm through her 6-inch stiletto heels, quote, "a little powder and a little drink on the way, and I'd pass their post with a wink and say, 'Do you want to search me? God, what a flirtatious little bastard I was,'" end quote. She's like, "Hey, I got some heels. I powder my nose. Let's go cross some Nazi checkpoints." Backing up a little here, when France fell to the Nazis, Nancy joined the escape network founded by Scottish Captain Ian Garrow. This network would later become part of the Pat O'Leary line, which was an escape line that helped Allied soldiers and airmen that were shot down or stranded evade capture and return them to Great Britain. This network was a collaboration with Belgian Major General Albert Mary Gueries, who helped to organize the routes. This chick was so dang good at smuggling people out of France that by 1943, the Nazi Gestapo began to catch on to her, and she became the #1 most wanted person with a bounty on her head at the price of 5 million francs, which in US dollars around that time was about $835,147. In today's money, that is $18.1 million, roughly. That is a rough estimate. $18.1 million of a bounty on this chick's head, because the Nazi Gestapo don't like her. That is insane. The Gestapo gave Nancy the nickname the White Mouse in reference to her ability to always elude their efforts to capture her. Like, do you know how much of a badass you need to be for the Gestapo to be like, "We gotta get her. Let's put an $18.1 million bounty on her head, and we'll give her the nickname of the White Mouse because she evades capture like a freaking mouse." Perspective. Just to give you an idea of how much danger Nancy was in, I mean, besides the obvious, yeah. The Gestapo was tapping her phone and intercepting her mail, along with, I'm sure, a couple of other things, but I couldn't find what they were, and the few that I did find, we're just not going to get into that. With these dangers, Nancy's cover had been blown in 1943 and had to get out of France. Her husband stayed behind to settle some family business ties. With Nancy's cover blown and the escape routes now crawling with Nazis, it took Nancy several tries to get out of France. With one of her tries, Nancy found herself in a train full of people and was arrested in Toulouse. But 4 days later, she was released with the help of Albert, who managed to convince the soldiers that Nancy was his mistress and they were trying to hide the affair from Nancy's husband. This is not true, but keep being tortured by the Nazis or fake an affair. Choices were made. Nancy would eventually get out of France on the back of a truck. During this escape, she had transferred onto a train, but she was forced to jump off of that train when it was going slow, drawing fire from German soldiers. But she got to Pyrenees, Spain in one piece. I don't know how. Somebody's watching her and they're loving her. Unfortunately, though, Nancy's husband was captured by the Gestapo and was tortured in order to get Nancy's whereabouts. But he wouldn't give in and was later executed. Nancy had no idea of her husband's death. From Spain, Nancy went to England and arrived in June of 1943. It was during her time in England and still wanting to stop the Nazis, she joined the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, and was trained in several programs. SOE was a secret British military intelligence branch ordered by Prime Minister Winston Churchill that specialized in conducting espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance, and was working with the French resistance. Basically, Nancy was becoming a spy. Now the chick is essentially becoming James Bond. Shoot. During her training, Nancy was trained in survival skills, Sten guns, rifles, pistols, grenades, plastic explosives, silent killing, whatever that is, codes and radio operations, and night parachuting. Vera Adkins was a female senior in SOE, recalls Nancy as, quote, a real Australian bombshell. Tremendous vitality, flashing eyes, everything she did well, end quote. And other trainees and trainers said she was, quote, a very good and fast shot, and was noted to, quote, put the men to shame by her cheerful spirit and strength of character, end quote. After her training in late April of 1944, Nancy was parachuted into Auvergne province in France along with 39 women and 430 men. Resistance leader Henry Tradivet found that Nancy had gotten tangled in a tree. He said, quote, I hope that all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit this year, end quote. To which Nancy replied, quote, cut out that bullshit and get me out of this tree, end quote. Stop flirting with me. I'm in a tree. Get me out of the tree. Their mission was to supply, organize, and train soldiers for the D-Day invasion. See why I wanted to talk about this chick? In preparation, Nancy organized her soldiers and set out to weaken German posts in the province. She led her team of 7,000 soldiers and did guerrilla attacks against Nazi forces. What am I talking about? Of around 22,000, greatly damaging their supply lines and posts. She did that. What? Let me give you a little more detailed picture of this chick. She inhaled cigars, bested her guerrilla fighters in drinking matches, traveled nowhere without her Chanel lipstick, face cream, and favorite red satin cushion. A French resistant colleague once said about Nancy, quote, she is the most feminine woman I know until the fighting starts. Then she is like 5 men, end quote. I love this. When a Nazi counterattack disrupted their lines of communications, Nancy was so pissed that she went on a casual 310-mile bike ride in 72 hours through hostile enemy territory, slept in haystacks, or just out in the open. She later says that that was her most courageous thing during all of her time in World War II. I just have to think how dedicated and PO'd do you have to be to do 310 miles over the course of 3 days through Nazi territory, sleeping on haystacks, or just in an open field, kind of as a, we'll see what happens, and not get caught by the Nazis? Oh, I like her. You will be happy to know that for Nancy, few Germans were in the area and she would successfully reestablish radio contact with London. Nancy was known to have killed an SS officer with her bare hands by giving a fatal karate chop to his neck to prevent him from alerting his unit at the head of a raid at a German gun facility. Nancy, what the heck is happening? Said in a 1990s television interview, quote, "They'd taught this judo chop stuff with the flat of the hand at SOE, and I practiced away at it. But this was the only time I used it. Whack! And it killed him all right. I was really surprised," end quote. I don't know what's going on either. I have something in my eyeball, so we're gonna take a quick break. Nancy did many things while preparing for D-Day. She helped organize thousands of Maquis fighters. Maquis was a band of rural guerrilla resistant fighters, and trained 7,000 partisans in preparation for D-Day. One notable event is after a raid that took out the Gestapo headquarters in Madlukan, killing 38 Germans. Nancy discovered that her men were using 3 captured girls as prostitutes and abusing them. This made Nancy very upset, and she let 2 of them go, but the 3rd she suspected was a German spy. After interrogating and exposing her, Nancy ordered her to be executed, but the men didn't have the heart to kill her in cold blood. But when Nancy said that she would do it, they caved and did it. Nancy showed no regrets for the execution. Quote, "I was not a very nice person, and it didn't put me off my breakfast. After all, she had an easy death. She didn't suffer. I knew her death was a lot better than the one I would have got. And if I hadn't done it and she had got away and reported to the Germans what the Maquis were up to, how could I have ever faced the families of the Maquisards we lost because of it? It was definitely the right thing to do," end quote. Nancy was a brilliant war strategist. On many occasions, she took control of Nazi and German units and facilitated victories in battles through stifling fire and ambushes. Though she clearly deserved all the respect, some of her fellow male leaders didn't give her anything close to respect. When Nancy had first arrived in Nazi-filled France, the first Maquis leader, Emmanuel Couloudon, also known as Colonel Gaspard, despised the British almost as much as the Germans and refused to work under a woman. One night, Nancy learned that Gaspard was plotting to kill her. We've really gone overboard here. Whoa. So Nancy really had no choice but to flee high into the mountains. But when she met up with Henry Fortier, another Maquis leader, he welcomed her with open arms, especially when Nancy brought a bunch of airdropped food and weapons with her. Once Nancy showed how fearless she was over and over and over again with the Maquis, they began to like her. Nancy always fought alongside her men, taking all the risks her soldiers did. In June of 1944, Nancy and her troops went against the full might of the German forces, and although her troops had to retreat, they had killed 1,400 Germans and had only lost 100 of their own men. Though they technically lost, they still won. Battles like this earned her awe and respect. So much so that this is so cool. So much so that all her men pitched in to build her own private quarters. They refurbished a broken down bus, put in a comfy bed, and silk curtains. I love that. That's so cool. Nancy's work helped lay the groundwork for the D-Day invasion that was executed on June 6 of 1944 and turned the tide of the war for the Allies. When the Germans began to retreat, Nancy was tasked with slowing their escape and stopping them from getting back home. With Nancy looking for them and the Gestapo looking for her, this started a deadly game of cat and mouse. This woman does not seem real. With the success of the D-Day invasion, the Germans began to be pushed out of France, and by August 25th of 1944, Paris was liberated. Nancy herself led her resistant troops into the city. That's freaking cool! Her return to Paris was bittersweet. During a victory celebration in Vichy, Nancy finally learned of her husband's death, and till the day she died, she never stopped blaming herself for her husband's death. When World War II ended, Nancy was immediately awarded the George Medal, a medal of the UK and the Commonwealth, the United States Medal of Freedom, the Resistance Medal, which is a medal from the French Committee of National Liberation, and the Croix de Guerre, or War Cross decoration from the French military 3 times. Yeah! She tried to find a job that suited her. She found work for the intelligence department at the British Air Ministry that was attached to the embassies in Paris and Prague. Nancy later stood as a candidate for the Liberal Party in the 1949 Australian federal election for the Sydney seat in Barton, running against Dr. Herbert Yvette and Ben Chifley. Though she lost this election, she ran against Herbert again in 1951. She lost this election as well, but the results were very close. After the election, she went back to England and worked as an intelligence officer at the Department of the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff and the Air Ministry in Whitehall. While working at the ministry, she met and married former prisoner of war and British Air Force pilot John Forward in December of 1957. Also in that same year, Nancy retired from intelligence, and in the early 1960s, Nancy and John went to Australia. She ran for the Sydney seat of Kingsford in 1966, and unfortunately, Nancy lost that election as well. Around 1985, Nancy and John left Sydney and retired in Port Macquarie in mid-north coast of New South Wales, Australia. In that same year, Nancy published her autobiography, The White Mouse. After 40 years of marriage, John died on August 19, 1997. They had no children. Nancy decided to sell her medals to fund her lifestyle, saying, quote, "There was no point in keeping them. I'll probably go to hell and they'd melt anyway," end quote. Nancy moved back to London in 2001 and moved into the Stanford Hotel in St. James Place. It was a British and American Forces club during the war and where Nancy had her first, quote, bloody good drink after the war. Surprisingly, the hotel welcomed Nancy with open arms. The owners took on her expenses, celebrated her 90th birthday, and welcomed her at the bar, giving her first morning gin and tonic of the day while telling war stories. In 2003, she moved to a nursing home for veterans in Richmond, London, where she stayed till her death. Nancy Wake died on August 7th, 2011 at Kingston Hospital after being admitted with a chest infection. She was 98. Whoa! She requested to be cremated and have her ashes scattered at Madlucan, the largest commune in central France. Her ashes were scattered near the village of Vernex, close to Madlucan on March 11th, 2013. Now, I could not for the life of me find her exact number of medals. Some say 9, I counted 12. Regardless, her medals are on display at the Australian War Memorial. Many biographies, novels, and TV characters have been inspired by Nancy. Even a minor planet is named after her. It's this whole thing. I don't freaking know where the planet is. The point is, She has a planet named after her. That is making it in my mind. In 1987, a made-for-TV movie called Nancy Wake was released, and Nancy ridiculed her portrayal in the movie in a scene of her cooking breakfast and then becoming romantic with a resistance member. God, Hollywood. Nancy said, quote, "For goodness sake, did the Allies parachute me into France to fry eggs and bacon for the men? There wasn't an egg to be had for love nor money. And even if there had been, why would I be frying it when I had men to do that sort of thing?" So there you have it. The story of Nancy Wake. Oh, I hope you all realize why I had to talk about her. I mean, I can't pass up a chick that is the #1 woman wanted by the Gestapo and the most decorated war hero in World War II, female-wise, and karate chops Nazis. It's video gold. If you learned something today, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And while you're down there, please leave a friendly comment. I'll be back next week with another video. And until then, don't be well behaved. You just might make herstory. See you next time, guys.